Lois Williams was a mother trying to raise her teenage daughter. Karen Williams was a high school student who never made it to class one morning. They disappeared together on a cold January night in Indianapolis, leaving behind an ordinary apartment and extraordinary questions about how many times a known predator was allowed to harm women before his world would come crashing down on him. This is their story.
Hi, I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Amy.
And you're listening to She Goes by Jane. At the end of this episode and every episode, we will be joined by a special guest who will read an original poem by Amy Baker about the women we're featuring. This week we are joined by podcaster Megan Storm.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Amy.
Vanessa, this story is one of the wildest that we've covered here. And I mean that in terms of once I began my research, I had no idea at any point where any of this was going.
Are you telling me this because you know I have a hard time keeping track of things?
Yes, there are a lot of details. There's a lot of twists. So some warnings for both you and our listeners before we begin. First, this takes place in the 1960s and 70s, and practically everyone has the same name. So expect multiple Karens, multiple Maureen's, multiple Roberts, a Charles, a Calvin, like all very similar names.
Okay.
Second, we don't include gratuitous details, but I think everyone should know we do talk about sexual assault in this episode.
Okay.
Third, this whole thing left me emotionally and I would say morally conflicted.
Now I'm really curious about the morally conflicted part.
You ready, Vanessa?
I'm ready.
Okay. January 25th. It's a still winter night in Indianapolis. The temperature hovers just above 30 degrees. A gusty wind sweeps along East 21st Street past a tidy brick apartment building. Upstairs, in apartment 32, a table light is still on. Nearby, resting open on a footstool, is a high school textbook belonging to 17-year-old Karen Williams. It looks as though she was preparing for classes the next day. Just inside the front coat closet hang two winter coats, Karen's and her mother, Lois's. That's how it appeared when neighbors gained entry 4 days later, worried after not seeing the single mother or her teenage daughter. The apartment was chillingly normal, nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. Except for one thing. No one ever saw Karen or her mother Lois again. They vanished completely that January evening, leaving behind only questions. What happened to the mother and daughter who disappeared together? And why was the man who likely took them allowed to keep hurting women long before anyone stopped him? But before all that, before Lois and Karen inexplicably disappeared from their East 21st Street apartment, they were leading a very typical life. Lois, then 35, was raising Karen largely on her own. She'd been divorced for 7 years at that point, her marriage officially ending around 1960. Divorce wasn't unusual then, though she stood out in her family. Lois and her sister Janice had both married after they graduated from college, but Janice's marriage was still going strong, and their parents Harold and Mildred had been married for almost 50 years. But Lois was making it work. She was considered a well-trained secretary, which meant she had steady work at United Auto Workers. She didn't even live that far from work, just 3 short miles down South Shadeland Avenue, where she could be at her desk. Still, her car was a critical part of her life, enabling her to go to work, bring Karen to where she needed to be, and run errands. That's why it was important to keep her 1957 Pontiac in good condition. Lois even gave her car a name. He was Charlie.
I know you're into cars, so this whole older car with a name probably is a linking point for you and Lois.
I've actually never named a car before.
Really?
Yeah, none of my cars have names.
But you love it when people name cars.
I do.
Yeah.
I loved finding out that she named her car Charlie. Now, by 1967, so this is a 10-year-old car at this point, Charlie is starting to show his age. He needed regular repairs and service. Now, thankfully, she enlisted the help of a nearby service station where she could get Charlie looked at regularly. Now, it's conveniently close, right at the corner of 21st Street and Shadeland Avenue. And on top of that, The owner, Ted Carr, seemed friendly and willing to diagnose any ailments that the aging Carr might have.
So we have a Carr named Charlie and a man named Carr.
Now, Carr wasn't the only person willing to help out. Lois and Karen also had a lot of support from Lois's parents, Harold and Mildred, which is why when Harold, he was a bit nervous about leaving the two when he and his wife departed for Florida that winter. But they were finally convinced that their daughter and granddaughter were just fine, and they left for Melbourne, Florida, around December 29th, 1966, just before the new year. That didn't mean that they were out of touch. There were regular calls, and Lois was a prolific letter writer, sending detailed missives to her parents frequently. And it was because of this regularity of communication between Lois and her parents, it was unusual when Harold and Mildred's phone calls were no longer answered and the letters stopped. Okay, so the timeline around Lois and Karen's disappearance is kind of hazy.
Okay.
We can assume that since it was a Wednesday, Lois would have had work on January 25th, and Karen would have had school at Arlington High School, where she was in the process of completing her senior year. And we do know that there are reports that concerned neighbors entered the home around January 29th, 4 days later, and find this lamp on, and everything's still in place, though, as though they'd intended to spend the evening at home. So nothing seems to come of this, and the official report of them missing doesn't happen until February 9th. Now, Harold had tried calling Lois and Karen repeatedly, but hadn't been able to get a hold of them. Days had passed as the phone rang and rang with no answer, and it was enough to concern anyone, but this was particularly, of course, out of character for Lois and Karen. But Harold had even more reason to be concerned than usual. He'd received a 24-page letter from Lois, and what it said was chilling.
24 pages?
Mm-hmm.
You said she was a prolific letter writer, but
yes.
Was that normal to get 24 pages?
Well, so you have to consider at the time, yes, they were having phone calls, but phone calls were particularly expensive long distance. So keep in touch with people in pre-email days, pre-text messaging. It wasn't unusual to send quite long letters. And what it sounds is that this is in character for her.
Okay.
It's the contents that had her dad worried.
That's right. You said chilling.
Now, Lois had sent this letter to her parents on January 19th, which was just 6 days before she disappeared. Though mail delivery took only a few days at this point, my guess is that it either didn't arrive or wasn't read until after the 25th, because I get the impression that her parents didn't talk to her after reading the contents of this letter, and given what it said, they very much would have wanted to. Again, this letter is long. It was likely written over a period of time. It details the everyday happenings that she and Karen were experiencing. She would write probably a little each day. In one part, she wrote, "Karen and I went to Clowers to see Phyllis Diller and sat with the pigeons in $2.50 seats." But as the letter went on, it detailed something more startling and devastating. She said that the owner of the service station, Ted Carr, had asked her to drive him to the airport. She was happy to oblige. After all, he'd been helping her out. But she said along the way, things changed. He forced her to get out of the driver's seat, and he took control of the car. Turning around, they headed east towards a cornfield. There, in her words, he acted like a wild man, and then he raped her. She said she resisted at first, but then she went limp, fearing that he would kill her if he didn't.
And this is just casually written into a letter along with going to see Phyllis Diller. This feels like a phone call.
Right, like a separate communication.
Right.
Yeah.
Like something more pressing than waiting for it to get sent in the mail.
So also in the letter, she says that he offered her $10,000 to stay quiet about it happening.
Mm.
Later, he offers her $100,000 if she would marry him. She rejected those offers. And it was clear from her letter that she was scared.
So all this is in the letter.
Yeah. I can't imagine getting a letter like that. Maybe she just felt more comfortable expressing it in a written letter than
maybe she didn't want her daughter hearing.
Right.
if she wrote it down.
Because they're in the apartment
right.
together. And so, at this point, they just get this letter and then they try calling her apartment.
Yeah.
She's not answering. So Harold knows that his daughter and granddaughter could be in danger. So when the police enter the Williams apartment, they, of course, find it empty, and they likely thought the same. There's nothing amiss in the residence. There's no indication that an act of violence occurred there or that they planned to leave. So there weren't very many paths to take, but they did know that they wanted to question Ted Carr.
Right. It seems like having that in the letter would be worth something.
Now, Ted Carr was not an unfamiliar figure in the area. Though his name was Melvin Chelcie Carr, he had gone by the name Ted for quite some time. Carr and his wife, Harriet, lived on North Olney Street for years. And if you're about to say, didn't he offer to marry Lois?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he did. But he's already married to Harriet.
So then how's he going to spend $100,000 to get a new wife?
Yeah, I don't think that Harriet's presence matters very much to him.
Okay.
Now, they live on North Olney Street. This is just 4 miles away from the service station. In addition to owning the service station, Carr was a carpenter by trade. He's quite skilled. His neighbor Charles said that he could build or make just about anything, so he was often hired for projects. But Carr could be violent. In 1962, he was charged with assault and battery with intent to kill against his wife, Harriet.
Oh, Harriet clearly doesn't mean much to him.
No, he has at least this on his record. But it's not the information that the neighbors knew. They were aware that they rarely saw Harriet and that Carr would often make comments about the other women on the block that would just make everyone uncomfortable. In addition, he seemed to be an insomniac. He would often do projects and dig in his backyard in the middle of the night. So he's odd for certain, but despite those things that made, the neighbors uncomfortable, they would still hire him for construction projects. One of those neighbors was a man named Calvin, and he lived across the street from Carr with his wife, Maureen. They'd hired Carr to work on their kitchen. Calvin worked at a local plant during the day, but when Carr asked him if he'd like to work part-time at the service station in the evenings, he jumped at the chance to make some extra money. In this position, Calvin knew Lois. After all, she had used the service station for her car regularly, but Calvin said that he wasn't allowed to work on Lois's car. Carr had told him in no uncertain terms that he was the only one allowed to. Calvin was working on the night of January 25th. He said he saw Lois there and that she and Carr got into Carr's 1965 Buick and left. He couldn't recall where they were going, but they were gone about 2 hours when Carr came back without her. Carr said that he'd been out with Lois and that she'd insisted on going into a bar, and she'd refused to leave, so he came back to the station without her. Close up at 10, Carr instructed Calvin before getting into his panel truck and driving away. Just as instructed, Calvin closed up the shop at 10, and he put the evening receipts in their usual place, then locked up the station doors before heading home for the night. The next morning, just as Calvin was getting ready for work, he was startled by a knock on the door. It was Carr's dad, James, who said that someone had robbed and beaten Carr the night before. Hurrying across the street, Calvin found Carr. He seemed dazed, and he was mumbling something about being attacked and robbed.
But then sometime between seeing him and now, he got beaten.
Right. And so, Calvin closes up the shop at 10 p.m. And between that point in the morning, Ted says he was attacked at the service station. Now, Calvin drags Carr up and he pushes him towards his bedroom. He's obviously needing rest, but as he's helping him, Calvin notices some curious details. First, Carr's clothes are soaking wet, and it hadn't rained that night, so that struck him as odd. Second, he had a lot of sand in his clothes, particularly in his shoes and socks, and it's not like it was typical to get sand in your shoes at the service station. Now, brushing this aside, Calvin suggested, let's call the police, but Carr was reluctant to. Finally, Calvin left and headed to the station with Carr's father to assess the damage. And given Carr's condition, Calvin likely thought that the station would be in disarray, but he was surprised to find that it was actually quite neat. The door was locked as he'd left it, the receipts were still in the register, and even the $60 in cash that Calvin had left the night before was still there. Everything seemed almost just as he'd left it, except that there was a car on the lift. It was Ted Carr's Buick. So Calvin locks up, and sometime after he locks up, Ted's car is put on the lift.
But Ted also gets beaten up, huh?
Now, the night before, the Buick had been parked outside before Ted had left in the panel truck. So Calvin was surprised, of course, to see it on the lift because it hadn't been there. It had been backed in. And when he looked at the car, he noticed that it was spotless. It had been thoroughly washed, including the interior.
Very suspicious.
Right. Now, Calvin, he didn't really know what to say. And at this point, no one knows that Lois is missing. And he couldn't really prove that Carr wasn't attacked because why would you claim that you'd been attacked?
Right.
On the night after the incident, Calvin would have had no way of knowing that Lois and her daughter were missing. As far as he knew, Lois was fine and she had been left in a bar that night. But after Lois's dad reported her disappearance, police easily traced her movements to the garage. First, her car is not at her apartment. Charlie is missing. They found Charlie sitting at a service station on East 10th Street, and police learned that Carr was paying for her vehicle to be stored there. A search of the car yielded that there was no evidence of violence inside, no blood or anything like that, but the storage rental payments created another clear link between Lois and Carr. As the investigation got underway, Sergeant Grubbs talked to Calvin, who filled in what he knew about that night and the last time he saw Lois. In fact, Calvin likely soon began to realize he was likely the last person to see Lois before she disappeared. But it was hard to wrap his head around the idea that Carr could have done something to her. Certainly, his boss and neighbor couldn't be capable of murder, could he? Now, Sergeant Grubbs warns him that that's exactly what could have happened. In the privacy of their home, Calvin shared this information with his wife, Maureen. Carr had gone from being a friendly neighbor to someone they both should keep an eye out for. It didn't take long for that caution to be tested. On April 11th, just under 3 months after Lois and Karen disappeared, Carr was admitted to the hospital for experiencing some dizzy spells. That evening, Maureen was at home when she got a phone call. Maureen, the voice on the other end said, "This is Ted. You know where I am, don't you?" Maureen glanced nervously out the window and across the street at Carr's house. She knew Carr was in the hospital. She'd heard they'd been running some tests on him, but Calvin wasn't at home. He was at his second job. So it's just Maureen at home getting this phone call from Ted Carr. Affirming that she knew that Carr was in the hospital, she wondered what Carr could want. "Can you check the rear door of my garage?" he asked. He went on to say that he had a lot of valuable tools in there and was worried that he'd forgotten to lock it. Maureen debated about what to do. In the past, she wouldn't have thought twice about this. She would have just headed over, locked it up for him, right? But after hearing Sergeant Grubbs' warning, she was much more cautious than she would have been, and so she actually declined to. Later, she would come to believe that this decision saved her life.
Are we going to have to wait till later to figure out why?
Yes.
Okay.
Because there's just so much.
Right.
Here.
Right.
Okay, so the thing that you need to remember is that Maureen got this weird phone call from...
And apparently saved her own life.
Yes. She trusted her
intuition and said no.
No. Now, Lois and Karen's disappearance, this may have haunted their family, but it would fade quickly from the media. Despite a young mother and her teenage daughter disappearing inexplicably on a rather typical January evening, there just wasn't a lot of press coverage about it. And the police didn't really seem all that energized to look for them either. Sure, they talked to Carr. He had been admitted to taking some suitcases from the Williams apartment. Without more clues and without bodies, the police weren't ready to make an arrest. They checked in on him every now and then, but that seemed to be about it. So, as is often the case, weeks turned into months, months turned into years with little hope of an answer. But the Williams family felt like they knew what happened, particularly Harold. In 1973, he erected a headstone for Lois and Karen at the cemetery the family used back in Muncie. He also wrote a letter to Carr telling him, "I never did trust you. Those poor girls never did harm to a soul on earth. The suffering for them is past. They are in God's heaven, but what about you, Ted Carr? Have you thought about your own death and what lies beyond? I can't imagine what your punishment will be. Can you?"
I kind of love Harold.
Yeah. He was not going to let Carr continue without reminding him. Now, this police inaction on Lois and Karen's case would actually have deadly implications because Ted Carr had a deeper history of violence, acts that began long before Lois and Karen disappeared and acts that continued after. I don't want to use the word monster when it comes to him because I think this makes us feel that we will always know when we encounter someone like Carr. Mm-hmm. And I think the greater lesson here is that he could be anywhere, a helpful stranger, considerate businessman, a husband, a neighbor. And for all of this, we actually have to go back in time a little bit to talk about who Carr was before he got to Indianapolis and what he did and what he did when he got there and how all of that connects to the search for Lois and Karen. I read somewhere that people don't know much about Ted Carr, but contrary to that, there's actually a lot of documentation of his life and clear signs every step of the way that this man should have been stopped long before January 1967. Though he'd been picked up for a few things like larceny and theft in his 20s, the first documented act of violence against a woman happened on October 28, 1947. I'm going to go more into this case in my newsletter, Girl Hunt, but the basic facts are here.
We'll be back in a moment.
Around that time, a couple, Robert and Betty Carney, were hitchhiking near Youngstown, Ohio, when Carr stopped and offered them a ride. He was in a 4-door sedan that was pulling a small trailer. The couple was trying to get to Kansas City, Missouri, and was hoping to get there to look for work, so they were happy to have someone finally pick them up. Not long after, Carr actually offered Robert a job at an Idaho hunting lodge. Now, in Nebraska, they stopped for the night beside a cornfield, and Carr said that Robert and Betty could sleep in the trailer and he'd take the car. And once they get back to the trailer, Betty said that she didn't think the job that he was offering was actually real. And her husband agreed with her. And the two were like, we should get out of here. So they tried to get out and walk. They made it about half a mile before Carr pulled up beside them and offered to take them to a train station. Now, facing walking along a desolate highway at night, they agreed and he drove them on a meandering route. At one point, he stopped the car and Betty tried to get back out. He pulled a gun on her and forced her back in. Eventually, he said the only way that the couple would get out alive is if Betty went back in the trailer with him. He handcuffed Robert and forced Betty into the trailer where he raped her. And he forced Robert to write a note saying that it was consensual. Robert and Betty managed to get away, and not long after, Carr was actually arrested for this. It seemed like a really cut and dry case. Mm-hmm. There's witnesses who saw Carr in the area. There's testimony from the couple. There's evidence. But Carr would never actually face those accusations in court.
What? Why?
This actually filled me with rage because, you see, Carr was actually facing other charges back in Ohio because earlier that year, he'd rented a car in Pennsylvania. He'd driven it to Ohio and then sold the stolen vehicle.
Okay.
That meant he was facing charges of auto theft and obviously the sale of stolen goods, right? But these were very specific charges. They fall under the Dyer Act, which prohibits stolen vehicles from being taken over state lines. And this is a federal charge, one that was deemed more important than the charges he was facing in Nebraska.
The Carr thing is more important than the Betty thing?
Yep, because the Carr thing was a federal crime. So despite having kidnapped, held hostage, and raped people, the Carr theft charge actually superseded all of that. And he was convicted of the Dyer Act violation. Now, by the time he gets out of prison, which is, I think, 5 years later, Robert and Betty, who were not natives of Nebraska, had, of course, moved on. They'd lingered there for a while, hoping to bring this to trial, but we're now years out, and then no one could find them.
So, and this was all in the 40s.
Yes. So we're 20 years before.
Yeah.
And so I can't help but wonder what would have happened if he had faced those charges in Nebraska. And honestly, I don't think he would have gotten more prison time necessarily, although Nebraska had some pretty strict punishments for them, but maybe it would have changed some sort of trajectory of his life, because it's clear to me that at some point Carr becomes convinced he's somewhat invincible.
Just psychologically, you think that if he would have gotten punished for that first crime, well, not first, but like the first rape, that it would have changed how he thought about that?
Yeah.
What message is that sending when actually harming a person physically and violently is considered less of a big deal than stealing a car?
Again, so he does this, he gets away with this. And then, of course, you know, Lois and Karen disappear. It seems to really probably solidify to him that he's not going to get in trouble. There's a lot that suggests that he should be pursued as a suspect. And then the case is just kind of dropped, right?
Right.
Now, that brings us up. So he's just living his life, right? And in 1971, so this is several years after Lois and Karen disappear, at this point, he'd given up the service station, and instead he'd opened up a Mexican pottery shop. And with this, he would travel regularly to Mexico to pick up goods for the store. So he's going back and forth. And so around this time, he meets a single mom named Maureen, who is different from the Maureen who's his neighbor.
Not Maureen and Calvin Maureen.
Right. Maureen has a teenage daughter who's 14 at the time, and Carr promises that he would teach the girl the inner workings of the pottery trade. She can learn some business from him.
Okay.
But to do so, they would need to travel together to Mexico so that she could meet suppliers and see how it all worked, right? And he said that it was possible that she might even be able to enroll in a private school in Mexico and that he would help pay for it. Now, Maureen, her mother, had no reason, I guess, not to trust him, because he told her that he was a deacon at a prominent church, and she trusted what he said, that he was this religious leader in the community. And also, her daughter wouldn't be going alone. Maureen's plan was to go with them on this trip. But along the way, Maureen claims that she received an emergency call. There was a problem back home, and so she had to leave the two, and they continued on without her, and she returned.
And that was of her own insistence, though.
Yes. Now, the daughter would later testify that Ted Carr raped her repeatedly on the trip. He said that she needed to keep quiet about this when they got back, and he even suggested that the two get married to save her, in his words, quote, the humiliation of ever having to testify against him.
So he raped her, so now she has to marry him so that she won't accuse him.
Really, it's because there are some protections for testimony between married couples. And if you're wondering, isn't he still married? He is.
But it's so crazy to me, and I don't know if crazy is the right word, but wild, whatever, that he, in the case of like Lois and Karen, he's going after the mom, But Maureen and her daughter, he's going after the daughter. There's no rhyme or reason to this dude.
No.
Like his victims, it's not predictable.
But I think that's the thing. We're taught, when someone attacks someone, they have a type of victim. And I think that's true for some attackers, some violent people, but I don't think that's true for everyone. And Ted Carr is an example. Now, her mother said she would be willing to sign paperwork stating that her teen daughter was actually older so that they could get married. So her mom's on board.
She was on board with sending her by herself, and she's on board with this, but he raped her child. Yeah. Her child.
Now, this is where some things do get a little bit fuzzy in Carr's life. Like, there are, multiple reports that he actually did file from divorce from his wife.
Okay.
And there are some reports that state he married the teen, and others said that he didn't officially. But he was actually picked up for these crimes in Houston, Texas. Now, basically what happens is after this Mexico trip, she refuses to travel with him again after the return home. But he still sent the teen a plane ticket to meet him in Houston.
So she's her mom lets this happen.
Yeah, so she's back home, and he says, basically, fly down and meet me in Houston. And she's like, no. But he does send her a plane ticket. Now, police are notified of his crimes and that he would be waiting for her at the airport. And he expected to meet her at the plane, but instead Carr was met by law enforcement. He would actually go on to serve time for this because this is also a federal crime. He transported her across state lines. Now, while there, he tries to order a hit on an elderly woman who had accused him of draining her bank account. You got to stick with me a little bit.
Okay.
So he's in jail and tries to order.
So in jail, because he can't kill her personally.
Yes.
He's trying to get somebody on the outside
to kill an elderly woman.
This accused him of draining her bank account.
Yes. She's a widow, and she had trusted him to help her sell a small piece of property, and she had given him power of attorney to do so. Instead, he actually used that access to drain her account, and he was likely using this money from this elderly widow in his pursuit of this teenage victim. So while he was in prison, he actually tried to hire someone to break into the widow's house and kill her.
Okay.
In addition, he also wanted the person to kill the teen girl.
Okay. As
well as 2 federal officers who had been involved in his arrest.
Whoa, 4 people.
Yeah.
Did that happen?
That falls apart.
Okay.
All of them were okay, but they did.
I didn't know where you were going with this.
Now, despite all of this,
yes,
he's let out of jail again. Prison again. So, and goes back. Everyone on this quiet street he lived in is going back to kind of monitoring his movements. Because there's one thing beyond his crimes that is consistent in his life. His wife, Harriet.
Okay.
Despite the attack on her life, despite what happened to Robert and Betty, despite what happened to the teen, despite the suspicions about the fate of Lois and Karen, Harriet stuck with him. And that could be for a range of reasons. I can't hazard a guess because I can't find any public statements from her about why she stayed. But when Carr got out of prison, he moved right back in with her.
It's so hard because as we're telling these stories, we kind of made the promise to not judge the innocent people on their motives. But with the teenage girl's mom and Harriet, I'm having a hard time sticking to that today.
Right. And which is part of that conversation, like I said at the beginning, that I would welcome a conversation from our listeners because I think this introduces a lot of complications. It just makes it hard to stick with it.
He's getting help along the way from these supposedly innocent people.
Yeah. I think with Harriet, what I'm trying to remind myself is that Harriet, one of the first arrests that we know about for him in this city is an attack on Harriet's life.
Right.
And so we know she's a victim of abuse from him.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to keep that in mind when thinking about her. Now, He moves back into like what is a pretty quiet street. It was then, it is now, and this choice would send shockwaves through the neighborhood. And that brings us to a night in April 1977. Harriet and her husband had spoken at least twice by phone, even though he was just out back in their garage, which, yes, did have its own phone line. He told her that he was busy and that under no circumstances was she to disturb him. And Harriet was perhaps used to this, listening to what Ted tells her to do. But by 4:30 a.m., without Carr coming in, Harriet noticed one of the garage doors ajar and actually did go to investigate. Inside, she could hear the car running, and there, inside on the garage floor, lay her husband.
He's just laying there in the garage?
Mm-hmm. So she turns off the car and quickly processes what she's seeing in the garage, and that's when she starts screaming. Neighbors were awoken by her screams because it wasn't just the shock of finding her husband, who was deceased, on the floor that had sent her into this. Carr was just behind the rear bumper of the vehicle, and inside the trunk were the bodies of 17-year-old Sandra Harris, 24-year-old Karen Mills, and Karen's 2-year-old son, Robert. All three were dead.
Jeez. So we haven't even talked about these three.
No.
And they're not on anyone's radar, and then he's dead and they're dead. This is very wild.
This is why I said, like, at no point did I know where this story was going.
Right.
Like, who are these three?
What is happening?
So obviously the investigation into this is very quick because 3 bodies, including that of a young child being found in a car trunk on a quiet residential street, is shocking. And the fact that Carr was inexplicably deceased is, I'm guessing, everyone in the city was wondering what had happened.
Right.
Investigators soon learned that Carr actually knew the 3 that were in the trunk of his car.
Okay, the 3 in the trunk. Okay.
Yeah. Karen's husband, she's one of the 3. She's the oldest. She's 24. Her husband was in jail for some burglary convictions. And there were rumors at the time that Ted and Karen were dating.
He's got to be kind of old at this point.
He is. And I would like to also say that there were also rumors at the time. You can see in the initial reports of Lois's disappearance that he's referred to as her boyfriend.
Okay.
So I cannot tell you what the extent of Ted and Karen's relationship actually was.
Okay.
That night, Karen and Sandra were seen at a local diner. The employees actually knew the pair well. In fact, Karen had worked there. So they
knew them.
Yes. And at some point they left.
Okay.
Much of what is known next about what happened comes from a man named Charles Crouch Jr.
Different Charles. Not Charlie, not Charles and Maureen.
Yeah.
Third Charles.
Charles was a 20-year-old carnival worker who had recently met Carr. Charles said that Carr had tried 5 times in the previous weeks to hire someone to enter Karen's apartment and to make it look like a burglary had happened there. Investigators suspected the plan also entailed killing Karen and Sandra.
So does Sandra live with Karen?
Yes.
Okay.
But instead, on April 18th, Carr picked up the women and the child from Karen's apartment and brought them to his garage around 10 p.m. So this is the garage in his backyard.
Right.
Now, Charles says he left them around midnight. At the time, everyone was alive, but the kid was asleep in the front seat, and Sandra was sleeping in the back seat. Karen was awake, sniffing glue from a paper sack. Charles was aware that some plan was afoot. I mean, I suspected he knew quite a bit because he'd been instructed to drive one of Carr's vehicles to a parking lot behind a tavern and leave it there. I'm assuming to give some sort of alibi for Charles, right? Like, oh, no, I saw his car at that bar, right? While Charles was gone, some sort of attack happened and Ted managed to wrestle both women and the boy into the trunk. He then inserted a hose into his muffler, ran it into the trunk, and turned on the car. The intent was to kill them with carbon monoxide. Scratch marks inside the trunk indicated that they were indeed alive when this happened. So he's attempting to kill them with carbon monoxide, right? Which does
It does
take
kill
a while.
Yeah.
And it does kill people, but it does take a while for that to happen. So sometime after, Carr tied a handkerchief around his nose and mouth and approached the vehicle. He needed to see if his plan had been successful. So instead, Carr himself succumbed to the carbon monoxide fumes, the concentration of which was in the garage and by the trunk, likely sending him into heart failure. In the end, Ted Carr accidentally killed himself.
Okay, so this guy does the dumbest thing possible.
Yeah.
And dies.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how many, because can we call him a serial killer?
So, no.
Serial rapist / murderer? Can we call him that?
Yes. Yes.
How many times have people like this actually accidentally killed themselves?
I can't help but think there's like some karmic justice here.
But at the same time, no one's ever going to get answers now.
Exactly.
Because we cannot talk to this man.
No.
Because he accidentally murdered himself.
Mm-hmm. While committing
While
the other
murdering
murders.
people.
Yeah.
Finally, he was going to get caught for something that he did.
Mm-hmm.
And no one can talk to him about it.
Yeah. But maybe he wouldn't have been caught for it.
That's true. That's true. Maybe Harriet would have gotten killed if he wasn't answering and she went back there. Like if he was just unconscious.
Yeah, because like the only reason she goes back there is because it's weird. He's not been in yet. The door's a little ajar. She goes back.
Okay, so if he would have ended up back in the house, she would have been just like, fine, it's all good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, the garage itself becomes a center for the investigation. Inside, the concrete had actually been cut into in some places, were patched. They believe that he had actually prepared for killing Karen, at the very least, by beginning to dig her grave by breaking up some of the concrete and starting to dig a hole in the dirt beneath.
So that would be great to search that, because what if that's where Lois and her daughter Karen are?
Yes. So this is exactly what police think.
Okay.
And at first, Harriet did seem amendable for the search of her property, and she allowed investigators to dig in the garage and some of the yards. They actually found in the garage suitcases that belonged to Lois and Karen.
Okay.
Which confirmed at very least a stronger connection between the pair, right? Soon after, Harriet actually rescinds her invitation to search the property. No remains were found during the search. But in many ways, this felt for a lot of people who cared for the search for Lois and Karen, that the search for them had been cut off, right?
Right.
And, you know, finding them there beneath the garage would have been, I think, maybe some wishful thinking on the part of the investigators.
Maybe.
Just, like, wrap it all up. Now, Maureen, the Maureen who lived across the street from Ted.
Okay. Calvin's Maureen.
She was likely able to breathe a sigh of relief when she got this news. Like, Maureen and Calvin had actually moved away in 1969, but talk of Ted Carr would have likely put them still on edge, right?
Mm-hmm.
After the bodies were found, Maureen recounted to investigators the strange calls she had received from Carr all those nights ago when he was in the hospital, and asked her to check his garage. It had never set right with her, and even though she knew he was spending the night hospitalized and getting tests, there was just something weird about it. Investigators also were struck by it too. And, you know, they're following every possible lead they could. Ted Carr wasn't there.
So he wasn't at the hospital when he called her?
Yeah, so he was supposed to be hospitalized overnight. And when they did a bed check, he was gone. Mm-hmm. And just after daybreak, he had actually returned and he was complaining about breathing problems. Now, this wasn't treated like a big deal because, you know, this is just a patient who decided to be non-compliant.
Right. He left. It was a mistake. He came back.
But now, Maureen and her husband would come to believe that Carr had actually placed the call to her from the phone in his garage, and that his request that she check the lock on his back garage door was just an excuse to lure her out of the house. And Maureen believed that she, too, could have been murdered by Ted Carr. I don't know quite why he would have centered on Maureen.
Like, how did he know that she was suspicious of him? Like, because you said that Calvin told Maureen what the officer said in the privacy of their own home.
Yeah, but maybe they were treating him differently. Maybe he was angry at Calvin.
Maureen definitely made a good call there.
Now, the trail of harm that Ted Carr left over the decades crisscrossed the United States. I find it hard to believe that he didn't commit any violent crimes between the violent assault on Betty in Nebraska and the disappearance of Lois and Karen, who I do strongly believe that he was involved in.
Yeah, because you said there was like a year gap. There's got to be more, right?
Yeah, I will always believe there could have been others who encountered him. Now, you asked if he was a serial killer.
Right.
And no, because the only murders he's technically tied to are Karen, Sandra, and Robert.
Okay.
Which would be classified as like a spree killing.
Because
killed them.
Lois and Karen were never.
Exactly.
And then we don't know about anybody else.
Yeah.
Because there could just be other people.
Yeah. So is
it likely he was a serial killer? Or, I mean, at the very least, he is a serial rapist and he is a killer.
Yes. So, I mean, in plenty of places, he's often referred to as a potential serial killer.
Okay.
But I think like one of the greatest tragedies is, of course, that so little is known about Lois and Karen and what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because we have Lois who's just holding everything together and she's on the cusp of seeing her baby girl graduate high school. And Karen, she's, only been thinking about preparing for her next day at school when she disappeared. And there's just so little information about either of them, which is perplexing and frustrating.
It's sad. Yeah.
And of course, there's Ted Carr, who his death in many ways is fitting, accidentally killing himself in the process is some justice, some sort of retribution. But I wish Karen Mills, Robert Mills, and Sandra Harris weren't taken as well. And though I know the odds are not great, I hope that one day Lois and Karen Williams can join their family in Muncie, Indiana's plot, and the family can be reunited.
We are now going to listen to Amy's poem, A Starlight Drive with Google Maps, a Pantoum, read by Megan Storm. Megan is the creator and host of A Simpler Time True Crime, a podcast revisiting unsolved cases from decades past that challenges the notion that a simpler time was a safer one. Through thorough research and a victim-centered approach, she explores forgotten mysteries, overlooked victims, and the lasting impact these cases have on families and communities. Her true crime interests began in childhood, watching cases unfold on TV with her mom, an experience that sparked a lifelong fascination with criminal investigation and the pursuit of justice. One of her favorite parts of podcasting is partnering with victims' families, survivors, and advocates to tell stories with care and accuracy, amplifying voices that might otherwise go unheard. Outside the podcast, Megan brings more than 15 years of human services leadership to her storytelling, grounding her work in advocacy, investigation, and compassion. When she's not researching a case, she can be found training for a race, trying new recipes, planning her next trip, cheering on Buffalo sports teams, or chauffeuring her 2 kids around town.
A Starlight Drive with Google Maps, a Pantoum. This poem is honoring the lives of Lois Williams and Karen Williams, missing since January 25th, 1967, from Indianapolis, Indiana. I drive your street from thousands of miles away, and I'm thinking of the women, their winter coats still hanging in the closet, a book resting nearby. I wonder what their last hours were. Every time I think of the women, the winter wind howling down the streets, scuttling snow until it rests nearby, I wonder what their last hours were, if they tucked down their chins against the cold, or if they howled down the streets, scuttling through snow until they slipped, fell against you as you took them. I wonder if they tucked down their chins against your cold hands and calculated how many steps it would take to get to freedom. That night, they slipped and fell. You took them, I wonder, each time I drive down your street from thousands of miles away, and calculate how many steps it would take to get to their freedom. Bring them back to where their coats are still hanging, waiting. I drive down your street from thousands of miles away, and I'm thinking of the women, their winter coats still hanging in the closet, a book resting nearby. I wonder what their last hours were every time I think of the women. The winter wind, howling down the streets, scuttling snow until it rests nearby. I wonder what their last hours were, if they tucked down their chins against the cold, or if they howled down the streets, scuttling through the snow until they slipped, fell against you as you took them. I wonder if they tucked down their chins against your cold hands and calculated how many steps it would take to get to freedom. That night they slipped and fell. You took them? I wonder each time I drove your street from thousands of miles away and calculate how many steps it would take to get to their freedom. Bring them back to where their coats are still hanging, waiting.
For more information about our show, please visit shegoesbyjanepodcast.com.
Bye, Vanessa.
Bye, Amy.